When the so-called HOA cops smashed through my lake cabin door at 3 a.m., they thought they'd catch me off guard and force me into submission. What they didn't realize was that my canines were trained, loyal, and waiting in the shadows. And once unleashed, the intruders learned very quickly that my cabin wasn't theirs to control. What began as a midnight power grab turned into a night none of them would ever forget. Karen had been furious ever since I made it clear that her HOA had no power over my lake cabin. My land wasn't part of her subdivision, wasn't bound by her bylaws, and never would be, but that didn't stop her from trying. She printed up violation notices that meant nothing, slipped fake fines under my door, and stood at the end of my driveway with her little posse of self-proclaimed enforcers, shouting about how I had to submit to their rules. Most days I laughed it off, because nothing she wrote on paper had any authority over me, but Karen wasn't the kind of person who could accept defeat gracefully. Each time I turned her away, her voice got louder, her threats more dramatic, her schemes more desperate. She called her group the HOA security team, but everyone else knew them as Karen's cops, a bunch of nosy neighbors who liked to play dress-up with fake badges and radios. They strutted around like they were law enforcement, but the truth was they were nothing more than bullies with clipboards. When intimidation didn't work, Karen whispered to her cronies that something had to be done, that I was a danger to the community, that my refusal to bend to her rules made me a criminal in spirit if not in law. I could see her planning something, the way she lingered near the edge of my property, the way her crew grew restless, the way their meetings ran late into the night. I didn't know when she would act, but I knew she would, because people like Karen only understood escalation. What I also knew was that if she came for me, she wouldn't be the one with the advantage. My K-9s had been trained for the day I brought them home, loyal and disciplined protectors, who never failed to sense a threat. Their ears twitched at the faintest sound, their muscles coiled like springs at the slightest movement, and their eyes never left the shadows when they knew something was wrong. They weren't just pets, they were guardians, and in the stillness of the lake cabin they were always alert. It was just after 3 a.m. when the attack came. The lake was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, broken only by the occasional ripple of water or the whisper of wind in the trees. My dogs stirred before I did, lifting their heads, their bodies tense. A low growl rolled from their throats as the sound of crunching gravel drifted through the night. I sat up, already knowing what was happening, already knowing who had finally decided to make her move. The footsteps were heavy, clumsy, too many for a quiet visit. Then came the first crack against the door, a violent jolt that rattled the frame. The second strike splintered wood. By the third, the door burst inward, crashing against the wall with a thunder that shook the cabin. Karen's so-called old cops poured inside, flashlights slicing through the dark, boots stomping, voices barking orders like they were conducting a raid. They thought they were catching me off guard, thought I'd be stumbling half asleep, too slow to resist. They couldn't have been more wrong. The instant their feet crossed the threshold, the deep growl of my K-9s erupted from the shadows. The intruders froze, their lights jerking wildly as eyes flashed back at them from the darkness. Then came the sound of claws on wood, the thunder of paws hitting the floor, and the snarl that made the blood drain from their faces. The first man shouted in panic as my lead dog lunged, teeth snapping, tearing the sleeve of his jacket before he even had time to swing his flashlight. Another stumbled backwards, tripping over a chair as the second K-9 lunged, pinning him against the wall with a ferocity that left him shrieking. The room exploded into chaos, their fake authority crumbling as the reality of snarling muscle and teeth bore down on them. They had come in like hunters, but in seconds they were prey, scrambling to escape the storm they had unleashed. Their radios crackled uselessly as they screamed over one another, their flashlights clattering to the floor, beams rolling wildly across the cabin walls. One man bolted for the door, only to be chased out by a growl so close he could feel the hot breath at his back. Another tried to swing a crowbar, but dropped it as a set of jaws clamped down on his arm, not breaking skin, but making sure he knew exactly how close he was to real pain. In less than a minute, their grand invasion had collapsed into a circus of terror. Karen stood in the doorway, frozen, her mouth open, her confidence obliterated. She had promised her little army an easy victory, but now she was watching them flee in disgrace, shredded clothes and shredded pride scattered across my porch. My K-9s returned to my side when I called, growling low, their eyes still locked on the intruders retreating into the night. The so-called cops huddled outside, clutching at torn sleeves and trembling hands, their bravado shattered. It didn't take long for the real authorities to arrive, called not by Karen, but by the noise that had echoed across the lake. The flashing lights that appeared on the road this time didn't belong to wannabe enforcers, but to actual deputies who knew me by name. They saw the broken door, the scattered tools, the panicked mob standing barefoot in the dirt, and their questions were sharp and fast. Karen tried to explain, tried to claim they were protecting the community, tried to spin a story about dangerous defiance, but her words sounded hollow against the truth of the scene. The deputies listened to her for less than a minute before one cut her off, telling her she and her crew had just committed a crime, and that if they thought pretending to be police gave them cover, they were dead wrong. The so-called whole cops wilted under the weight of real authority, their eyes darting like cornered animals. Karen sputtered, her hands flapping, insisting this was all a misunderstanding, that they were only trying to enforce rules, that the community depended on their actions. But no one was listening anymore. The deputies turned to me, their tones calm, asking if I was all right, asking if the dogs needed to be checked, promising that repairs to the cabin would be covered once the charges stuck. I nodded, my K9 sitting silently at my side like statues carved from loyalty and strength. Karen's empire crumbled completely that night. Her so-called cops were marched away in shame, their bravado gone, their fake power stripped bare. She stood alone, shaking, her voice trembling as she tried one last time to order the deputies to take me away. They didn't even bother responding. They simply looked at her with pity and disgust before warning her that if she ever tried something like this again, she'd be the one in handcuffs. When the cruisers finally disappeared into the night, the cabin returned to silence. My door hung broken, my porch littered with the remnants of Karen's failed raid, but my home still stood strong. My K9s lay at my feet, calm again, their job done, their loyalty unshaken. Karen had thought she could break into my world, thought her fake cops could intimidate me, thought fear would make me bend. But what she learned that night was carved deep into her memory. Some homes are untouchable, some guardians never sleep, and some men are never caught off guard. Karen had been building her army of self-proclaimed old cops for months, strutting around the lakeside like she was queen of the community, handing out fake tickets and threatening anyone who dared ignore her demands. She hated that my cabin stood free from her rules, hated that I refused to pay her bogus dues, hated most of all that I laughed when she shoved notices in my face. The others in the neighborhood cowered, but I never bent, and that made me her obsession. She talked about me constantly, told anyone who would listen that I was a menace who needed to be taught a lesson, and she convinced a handful of gullible neighbors to join her in playing cop. They carried radios, wore knockoff uniforms, and marched around with a false sense of power. I ignored them most days, but I knew Karen's anger was festering. The air that night was heavy and still, the lake lying glassy under the moon when my dogs stirred from their beds. Their ears pricked, their low growls vibrating through the cabin floorboards. I sat up instantly, because when those dogs growled, it meant trouble. A moment later, gravel crunched outside, then muffled voices and the sound of boots creeping closer. Before I could even move toward the door, the first blow slammed against it. Wood cracked, the frame shuddered, and another strike followed. My K9s bristled, snarling deep in their chests, muscles tight like coiled steel. A third strike splintered the lock, and with a deafening crash the door burst inward, crashing against a wall. Flashlights blazed through the darkness as Karen's so-called cops stormed in, shouting commands like they were storming a fortress. They expected to find me stumbling half asleep, disoriented and defenseless. Instead, the moment their boots hit my floor, my K9s launched from the shadows with a roar of snarls and snapping jaws. The intruders froze in shock, their fake authority dissolving instantly as they came face to face with pure fury on four legs. One dog lunged straight at the man in front, ripping his sleeve clean off as he shrieked and stumbled back. Another slammed into a second man, pinning him against a wall, teeth bared inches from his throat. The cabin erupted in chaos. Radios crackled, flashlights clattered to the floor, beams spinning wildly across the room as Karen's fake enforcers screamed and stumbled. My dogs were relentless, not biting to maim but striking with enough precision to terrify and dominate. A deep growl echoed as one intruder swung a crowbar, only for it to be ripped from his grip by snapping jaws. Another tried to bolt back through the doorway, but a blur of fur chased him, forcing him to dive headfirst into the dirt outside as the dog stopped just short of tearing his leg. The air filled with curses, panicked orders, the screech of grown men begging for mercy as they realized they had stepped into a fight they couldn't win. Karen herself stood in the doorway, her face pale, her confidence collapsing as she watched her little army fall apart. She had promised them control, promised that I'd be humiliated and forced to obey, but now all she could do was gape in horror as her enforcers scrambled and screamed. My K-9 circled back to me when I called, still growling, their eyes fixed on the intruders huddled outside in the dirt with their clothes shredded and their pride in pieces. Not one of them dared step forward again. Then the wail of sirens cut through the night, red and blue lights flashing across the trees as real deputies arrived. They'd been drawn by the commotion, the noise of a door being smashed and men shouting like a brawl had broken out. Karen straightened, forcing a grin, waving her arms as if she was about to be vindicated. She rushed toward the cruisers, babbling about how she and her security team had been enforcing HOA rules and needed backup to arrest me. The deputies looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Their flashlights swung to my shattered door, to the crowbar lying on the floor, to the bruised and panicked men cowering in the dirt, and their questions came fast and sharp. Karen stammered through excuses, tried to paint herself as the victim, claimed that I had threatened the community and her team had acted out of necessity. But her story unraveled with every word. The deputies had no patience for her theatrics. They knew me. They knew my property. They knew I wasn't under HOA control. And they knew, just by looking at the scene, exactly who had been the aggressors. Their voices turned cold as they told Karen and her group that what they had just done was not only reckless, but criminal. Breaking and entering, trespassing, impersonating law enforcement, charges stacked higher with every explanation they offered. The so-called cops shrank under the glare of real authority, their bravado gone, their fake badges suddenly useless. Karen sputtered, insisting she was right, that her rules mattered, that they had the right to enforce them. One deputy finally cut her off, telling her in no uncertain terms that she had no authority here, that her entire stunt was an embarrassment, and that if she thought she could bully her way into power, she had just made the worst mistake of her life. The others stood silent, too shaken to argue, their heads hanging as the deputies took their statements with growing irritation. By the time the last cruiser pulled away, Karen's empire collapsed. Her fake cops were facing charges, her credibility in ruins, her reputation shattered beyond repair. She stood in the shadows, eyes wide and burning with a mixture of rage and fear, but she couldn't say a word. My cabin was still standing, my dogs at my side, calm again now that the danger had passed. I looked at the wreckage of the door, the scattered tools, the abandoned flashlights, and I couldn't help but think how Karen had believed this would end with me on my knees. Instead, it ended with her army destroyed and her power gone. The lake fell silent again, the calm returning as the last echoes of sirens faded into the night. My K-9s curled at my feet, loyal and steady, guardians of a home that no one would ever invade again without consequences. Karen had thought she could control me, thought she could break me with force and intimidation. But what she learned that night was simple and unforgettable. I was untouchable, my home unshakable, and with my dogs at my side, no army of imposters could ever bring me down. Karen had spent weeks parading around with her so-called security team, puffing her chest out and bragging that soon my cabin by the lake would fall under her control. She could never accept that my land wasn't hers to govern, that I had never signed a single HOA document, that my property stood free and independent. That ate away at her pride, and in her mind the only way to deal with someone who defied her rules was to crush them. She gathered a gang of neighbors desperate for her approval, dressed them in matching jackets, handed them knockoff badges, and convinced them they were a real enforcement squad. They called themselves the HOA cops, strutted up and down the neighborhood, and barked at anyone who crossed Karen. Most people were too intimidated to push back, but I wasn't. Every time they shoved fake violation slips in my face, I tore them in half and tossed them in the trash. Karen's rage boiled hotter with each rejection, until I could see it in her eyes that something more dangerous was coming. The night it happened was heavy and still, a kind of silence that settles over the lake like a warning. My dogs were the first to sense it, ears snapping forward, bodies tightening, low growls vibrating deep in their chests. I trusted them more than alarms because they never growled without calls. Then came the faint crunch of gravel, the whisper of feet moving in the dark, too many to be a lone passerby. Before I even left my chair, the first blow hammered against the cabin door. The frame shook. A second blow splintered the lock. With a third, the door exploded inward, wood cracking like a gunshot as half a dozen figures surged through, flashlights stabbing the dark, voices shouting orders like they were conducting a raid. They thought they were storming a helpless man, but the instant they entered the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. My K9s exploded from the shadows with a sound that froze them in place. The deep guttural snarls rattled the walls, then came the thunder of paws slamming the floorboards. One intruder screamed as a powerful body collided with him, teeth clamping onto his sleeve and ripping it away like paper. Another stumbled as a dog leapt, forcing him against the wall with jaws bared inches from his throat. Radios crackled uselessly, flashlights clattered to the floor, and the air filled with shrieks of men who suddenly realized they were not hunters but prey. The chaos was instant and absolute. One man tried to swing a crowbar but dropped it as jaws snapped shut around his wrist, not breaking skin but promising devastation if he dared move. Another turned to run only to be chased out into the night, falling face first in the dirt as hot breath and snarls followed him to the edge of the porch. Karen's mighty HOA cops were tripping over furniture, crashing into one another, and screaming for help as my dogs herded them with terrifying precision. The so-called enforcers who once strutted around with smug confidence were now nothing but terrified intruders clawing for escape. And there in the doorway stood Karen. She had promised her army victory, promised them I would finally bow, promised that this raid would be the night her power became absolute. Instead, she stood frozen in disbelief as her soldiers fell apart in seconds. My K9 stood bristling in front of me, muscles taut, growls rolling like thunder as the last of her crew stumbled outside, their clothes shredded, their fake badges hanging by threads, their pride broken into pieces. Not a single one of them had the courage to step forward again. Then the real sirens came, echoing across the lake, red and blue lights flashing against the trees. The deputy stepped out with calm authority, scanning the wreckage of my broken door, the tools scattered across the floor. The intruders huddled outside with wild eyes and trembling hands. Karen rushed to them with a fake smile, babbling that her security team had been enforcing rules, that they were defending the community, that I was a danger. The deputy stared at her with open disbelief. They had known me for years. They knew this property. They knew it had nothing to do with Karen's HOA. And they knew by a single glance exactly who had been in the wrong. Her excuses fell apart before she finished them. The deputies cut her off, their voices cold, telling her and her crew that they had committed crimes tonight, breaking and entering, trespassing, impersonating law enforcement, assault with tools. Her men shrank back, muttering that it wasn't their idea, that Karen had told them it was legal, that they didn't mean for it to go so far. Karen sputtered, her voice rising, insisting that her authority mattered, that her bylaws gave her power here, that they had the right to act. The deputies didn't even try to hide their disgust. One told her plainly that she had no authority here, that her HOA nonsense stopped at the edge of her neighborhood, that what she had done tonight was a reckless stunt that could have gotten people killed. The so-called old cops wilted under the weight of reality, their bravado gone, their leader exposed as a fraud. Karen's face twisted with fury and humiliation, but for the first time she had no audience to cheer her on. The deputies warned her that if she ever tried anything like this again, she would be the one in cuffs. The men who had once called themselves her cops couldn't even meet her eyes. When the cruisers finally pulled away, the night returned to silence, broken door hanging loose on its hinges, my porch littered with broken flashlights and torn jackets. My K9s lay at my feet again, calm, steady guardians who had done their job without hesitation. Karen had believed she could smash into my cabin, that her little army could overwhelm me, that her fake power could stand against real strength. But all she learned was that some homes are never taken, some guardians never fail, and some men never bow. Karen had never forgiven me for refusing to join her HOA, no matter how many times I explained that my cabin by the lake was not within her jurisdiction. She could not stand the thought of one property standing independent, free from her fines and her fabricated rules. Over time, her irritation grew into obsession, and obsession turned into rage. She built herself a little squad, neighbors she manipulated into playing along, people desperate for approval who she dressed up with fake badges, radios, and matching jackets. They strutted around like a private police force, barking orders and writing worthless tickets. She called them HOA security, but everyone else just called them Karen's cops. They were a joke until the night they decided to make themselves dangerous. The lake was still and silent at 3 in the morning when my dogs raised their heads. Their ears snapped forward, bodies stiffened, low growls rolling through the cabin. They were trained to react only when something was truly wrong, and I trusted them more than alarms. A moment later I heard it too, the crunch of feet on gravel, the muffled whispers of too many voices moving in the dark. Then came the first crash against the cabin door. The frame rattled, wood cracked, and another blow followed harder. My dogs growled louder, muscles tense, their eyes locked on the door. A third strike shattered the lock, and with a deafening bang the door burst inward. Flashlights pierced the darkness as Karen's fake cops charged inside, shouting commands as if they were executing a raid. They expected to find me stumbling half asleep, caught off guard and helpless. Instead, they stepped straight into the jaws of a storm. My K9s exploded from the shadows with a ferocity that froze them in place. Snarls shook the walls, claws tore against the floorboards, and in an instant the intruders were no longer aggressors but prey. One man shrieked as a powerful body collided with him, teeth clamping onto his sleeve and dragging him to the floor. Another was slammed against the wall, eyes wide in terror as hot breath and gleaming teeth hovered inches from his throat. The cabin descended into chaos. Radio screeched useless static. Flashlights fell and rolled across the floor, beams spinning wildly as men tripped and screamed. My dogs moved like lightning, snapping jaws, tearing sleeves, and shredding their fake uniforms, never breaking skin but leaving no doubt about what would happen if the fight continued. A crowbar clattered to the floor as one of them tried to swing, only to find his wrist trapped in a set of teeth that promised devastation if he resisted. Another stumbled backward out the door, crashing into the dirt outside as a dog chased him to the porch, stopping just short of his leg. The air filled with curses and panic cries as Karen's proud enforcers begged for mercy. Karen herself stood in the doorway, frozen, her confidence collapsing in front of her eyes. She had told them this raid would prove their strength, that I would finally bend, that tonight her HOA ruled supreme. But she had miscalculated everything. In less than a minute, her little army was broken, stripped of courage, their fake power shredded like the jackets hanging from their shoulders. My K9s returned to my side at my call, still growling, their eyes fixed on the intruders huddled outside in the dirt. Not a single one of them dared to move forward again. Then the real sirens came, cutting through the night, red and blue lights flashing across the trees. Deputies stepped out, their flashlights sweeping over the wrecked door, the scattered tools, the terrified intruders. Karen rushed toward them, forcing a smile, babbling that her team had been enforcing community rules, that I was a danger, that they had authority to act. The deputies stared at her in disbelief, then looked back at the scene, and the truth was obvious. They had known me for years. They knew my cabin wasn't HOA property. They knew Karen had no jurisdiction here, and they could see immediately who had been the aggressors. Her excuses unraveled faster than she could speak them. The deputies cut her off sharply, voices cold, telling her and her crew that what they had done was criminal. Breaking and entering, trespassing, impersonating law enforcement, each charge stacked higher as they listed them out. Karen sputtered, her voice rising, insisting she was right, that her bylaws mattered, that her rules applied to everyone. But no one was listening. Her followers shrank back, muttering that it had been her idea, that they didn't know it would go this far, that they thought it was legal. The deputies weren't swayed. They told Karen plainly that her fantasy of power ended here, that her fake cops had no authority. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. Karen's face twisted with fury and humiliation as the deputies warned her that if she ever tried anything like this again, she would be the one in cuffs. The men who had once strutted at her side couldn't even meet her eyes. Their bravado had drained away, replaced with shame and fear. The mighty HOA cops were reduced to nothing more than trespassers caught in the act, their fake power stripped bare. When the cruisers finally pulled away, silence fell again. My door hung broken, a porch littered with flashlights, tools, and torn jackets. My dog settled at my feet, calm again, steady as stone, guardians who had proven once more that they would never let me fall. Karen had believed she could smash into my home, that her little army could intimidate me, that her rules could stand where they had no place. But what she learned that night was a lesson she would never forget. Some homes are untouchable, some guardians never sleep, and some men never bow. Karen never let go of her obsession with controlling everything around the lake. My cabin stood outside her HOA boundaries, but that didn't stop her from trying to claim authority. Every time she marched up with her fake fines and violation slips, I told her the same thing. She had no power here. That only made her angrier. Soon she wasn't satisfied with shouting or shoving papers in my face. She wanted to prove she could dominate me, to show the entire neighborhood that no one could resist her. That's when she created her little army, a group of neighbors desperate for her approval, who paraded around in jackets and badges she had printed online. They carried radios, barked orders, and strutted through the streets, calling themselves HOA cops. Everyone else knew they were clowns, but Karen believed her own fantasy. She promised them that together they would bring me under control, that I would be forced to submit. I ignored them, but deep down I knew sooner or later she would make her move. The night it happened was still and quiet, the lake reflecting the moonlight like glass. Inside the cabin, my canines rested at my feet, loyal and alert even in their sleep. Their ears twitched before I heard anything. Then came the growls, low and deep, vibrating through their chests. They rose in unison, muscles taut, eyes fixed on the door. A moment later I caught it too, the crunch of boots on gravel, too many to be a lone visitor. Whispers carried through the night air, then the thud of a body slamming against the doorframe. Wood cracked. Another blow followed harder. The dog snarled louder, teeth flashing the dim light. With a third strike, the lock burst and the door crashed open. 6 figures stormed in, flashlights cutting through the dark, voices barking commands like they were running a police raid. They expected me to be half asleep, confused, defenseless. Instead, they met the unleashed fury of 2 trained canines. The instant they crossed the threshold, my dogs charged, snarls echoing off the walls like thunder. One intruder screamed as his arm was caught in powerful jaws. His sleeve shredded as he stumbled backward. Another was slammed against the wall, pinned by 100 pounds of muscle and teeth hovering an inch from his throat. Radios squawked uselessly as the men panicked. Flashlights fell and rolled across the floor, beams jerking wildly over the cabin walls. The air filled with chaos. Shouts, curses, screams of fear as grown men begged for mercy while they were herded like cattle. One man tried to swing a crowbar, but it was ripped from his grip as a dog snapped onto his wrist, holding firm but never breaking skin. Another bolted for the door, crashing into the dirt outside with a howl of terror as hot breath and a snapping jaw chased him off the porch. The rest scrambled into corners, waving their arms desperately as the dog circled, growls vibrating through the floorboards. Karen had told them this would be easy, but in less than a minute her entire squad was reduced to a pile of whimpering intruders, praying the nightmare would end. Karen herself stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale, her mouth open as she watched her dream unravel. She had promised them glory, promised they would see me humiliated and broken. Instead, she was watching her army collapse into terrified wrecks, their fake badges dangling uselessly as they tried not to cry. She had no words, no commands, no authority left. My dogs stood guard in front of me, steady and unshaken, their eyes locked on the intruders until I called them back. They returned to my side, still growling, their presence alone enough to keep the so-called cops huddled outside in the dirt, their pride shredded as thoroughly as their clothes. Then the wail of sirens cut through the night, red and blue lights flashing across the trees. The real deputies arrived, stepping from their cruisers with calm precision, flashlights sweeping across the wreckage. They saw the shattered door, the crowbar on the floor, the bruised and shaken intruders clutching torn sleeves. Karen rushed toward them, voice trembling as she tried to spin her tale. She babbled that they were enforcing community rules, that I was a threat, that they had authority. The deputies exchanged a look of disbelief, then turned their attention back to the evidence spread out before them. They knew me. They knew my cabin. They knew this land wasn't HOA property. And they knew immediately who had crossed the line. Her excuses didn't last a minute. The deputies cut her off, their tones sharp, listing the crimes she and her crew had just committed: trespassing, breaking and entering, impersonating law enforcement. The words hit harder than any blow, and suddenly her brave squad couldn't look her in the eye. They muttered that it had been her idea, that they thought it was legal, that they hadn't meant for it to go this far. Karen shrieked at them to stay quiet, insisted that she was right, that her authority was real, that her bylaws applied everywhere. The deputies ignored her. They told her flatly that her HOA stopped at the edge of its own neighborhood, that her fake cops were nothing more than trespassers, and that she was lucky no one had been seriously injured. The so-called cops hung their heads, stripped of all bravado. Karen sputtered, her face burning with fury and humiliation, but she had no more power to command. The deputies warned her that if she ever tried anything like this again, she would be the one in cuffs, dragged away in front of the entire community. No one cheered for her this time. No one followed her lead. Her empire had collapsed before her eyes, undone by her arrogance. When the last cruiser drove away and silence returned to the lake, I stood in the doorway of my battered cabin, my dogs lying calmly at my feet, their job done. The porch was littered with broken tools, torn jackets, and abandoned flashlights. The night air was still again, but the memory of snarls and screams still echoed. Karen had believed she could smash into my home, that her fake cops could intimidate me, that her rules mattered here. What she learned instead was carved deep into her pride. Some homes are untouchable, some guardians never fail, and some men will never bow.